Today, fabulous scholars, we are going to finish the Knight's Tale and hear about what happens with Palamon and Archite. Right now, they are really working hard on their chivalry, their courtly love, because they've said they've fallen in love with the Lady Emily, although they have not actually met her. They've just seen her really more from a distance. And they are both now in trouble because they've been captured by Duke Theseus, and the consequence for that is death. So Duke Theseus wanted to know why the two cousins, who are supposedly best friends, are fighting. And they both leap to the Lady Emily and say, because of her. And so that's where we left off. They're at her, or by her saddle. And so Archite sprang to one stirrup, Palamon to the other. Lady, your eye has scorched me like a burning glass. Emily, your name is a millstone crushing my heart. Sweetheart, if I were to live to be 200. Enough, roared Theseus. What is this? A competition of compliments? If you're going to compete, at least do it the knight's way. Tomorrow, I'm holding a joust. Both your lives are forfeit, which means they have to give up their lives. But I shall spare the man who remains alive when your joust ends. Prepare yourselves, for tomorrow you fight in the lists. Not until sundown, when they were billeted, staying in separate tents on the field of combat, did Palamon and Archite stop quarreling. Outside Archite's tent, an armorer was sharpening a sword with a stone. It grated and screeched. A chill went through the knight, but he called to mind Emily's radiant face and went happily to sleep. Outside Palamon's tent, a squire was sharpening his master's lance with a knife. The shavings fell onto the canopy and made shadows like a swarm of spiders. A chill went through Palamon, but he thought of Emily and how pleased she would be by his chivalrous heroism, and he went to sleep contented. The joust was a circus of color. Knights caparisoned in mail, that means covered in chainmail, heraldic surcoats and plumes fit for birds of paradise, were brazed by the blaring of trumpets, whose scarlet oriflammes, that means hanging banners, were embroidered with silvery beasts. Blade by blade, the grass was turfed out in divots by the flying hooves of horses. The pavilions, the big tents, flapped like Chinese kites. By midday, the ladies tripping back and forth to their seats had scarlet hems where their gowns had swept the field. I thought grass was green. What's making the edges of their dresses red? Uh-oh. In the hottest part of the day, Archite and Palamon found themselves at opposite ends of the jousting fence. Palamon's lance weighed heavy in the crook of his arm after so many months in prison. The squires blew a shrill fanfare on their trumpets. The horses rattled their bits between their teeth and pranced towards one another. On the first pass, both lances missed their mark, and the two cousins passed shoulder to shoulder, grimacing into one another's face. On the second pass, Palamon saw the point of Archite's lance bearing squarely for his chest. He flung himself forward along his horse's neck, dropping his own lance. But the oncoming lance tip tore through the back of his tunic, got caught in his belt, and lifted him out of the saddle, pitching him to the ground. Archite's lance was dragged from his grip, but he turned at the head of the lists and came galloping back down the field, swinging his mace. That is a heavy metal ball with spikes all over it, usually at the end of a chain. If it hits you, you're a goner. Its iron spikes bruised the air with each whistling circle the mace had made on its chain stalk. Palamon, his head uncovered, fell to his knees, but he knew he could not escape the swinging iron. So this is what's coming for his head without a helmet on it. In the grass, his hands brushed the lance that had dragged him from his horse. His fingers closed around its half, and he was lifting it to protect himself when Archite, stretching from the saddle to strike the mortal blow, rode straight into its point. This is the exciting part, Maud. His face cleared of all expression. His horse rode out from under him, and he stood there for a moment with the lance planted in his chest. The mace dropped from his hand, and he spread his fingers across the red of his surcoat. "Cousin," he said, then fell dead on his back, the lance rising like a mast out of its hull. Palamon took off his gauntlets, his gloves, and crawled across the grass to Archite's side. "Friend," he said, touching his cousin's cheek, "what have we done?" Then the crowds were around him, praising and congratulating. Duke Theseus was there, and Emily too, though Palamon could not recognize her at first among the other women. They were all quite pretty. Theseus began, "Archite, my boy." "Palamon, I'm Palamon." "Oh, yes, well, Palamon, my boy, let this be an end to all quarreling. Your rival has died a glorious death in the name of chivalry, and you have fought bravely too. Take Emily's hand and forget every unhappiness. The wedding shall be tomorrow." Hanging back in the shadow of her brother-in-law, Emily said, Do I have to? His hair is awfully thin already, and I don't like his mouth." She had a voice like the teeth of a comb, clicking. "Nonsense, Emily. He's a very chivalrous knight, even if he is a foreigner. Emily, Archite, my blessing on you both." "Palamon, I'm Palamon," said the chivalrous knight, while at his feet Archite raised no argument whatsoever. The knight stopped speaking. The woman in the enormous hat, who I learned was a widow all the way from Bath, had been leaning out of her saddle to catch the knight's words. She was rather deaf, I think. She continued leaning towards him, waiting for more. "Well," she demanded in a huge West Country voice, "were they happy?" The knight shook himself. "Yes. Oh, yes. They both lived happily ever after. Palamon woke to each day happier than the day before." The widow smiled and sat back in her saddle with a thump. "I don't know if he would be happier under the circumstances," I said. "Under these circumstances," said the knight, waving a hand towards the listening pilgrims, "we have to have a happy ending. Now, who will be next?" "All the same," said a pebble-headed reeve snarlingly, "it wasn't a whole heap of laughs, your story." The knight freely admitted it. "I'm afraid I couldn't think of a funny story offhand." "Well, I can," said the reeve. We seemed to be about to hear his story, whether we liked it or not. A reeve, by the way, scholars, is a carpenter. "Who asked you?" Red as a firebrand, the miller's hair and beard showed through the mist like beacons. With flaring black nostrils housed in a red tufted nose, the miller rampaged down on us like a wild boar. The reeve's fingers closed around the handle of the carpenter's mallet, but he did not pull it from his saddlebag. "What do you want, Matt?" he said, blipping the miller's horse on the nose with his reins as it cannoned into him. "Isn't it bad enough to be traipsing through fog and rain and up to our noses in mud?" answered the miller. "It's the best place for your nose," muttered the reeve. "Well, isn't it bad enough without having to listen to a chiseling carpenter?" Hey, what is this between you?" said Harry. "Have you two brought some old grudge along with you?" Oswald the reeve did not so much answer as growl in the general direction of Matt. Just because I did him a favor, I made him a lean-to, a little leaning room for his mill, and at a price he wouldn't get from any carpenter in the south of England. This is the thanks I get. The wood was so rotten it fell on my head the first time I so much as touched it. At the price you paid, what do you expect? Mahogany? Whoa there, Harry protested. Let's have a story, not a war. But the reeve was off sulking by this time. Or perhaps he rode off to the back of the line to be a safe distance from the miller's swinging fists. I swear, Arkite's mace, swinging down on Palamon's head, couldn't have done more damage than those fists at the end of those arms. The moment the reeve was out of sight, Matt the miller cheered up hugely. He got out his bagpipes and struck up a tune, so hideously strident, so tunelessly discordant, that we begged him to stop and tell us a story instead. I was hoping you might say that, he said, and the drone of his pipes died away like expiring sheep. Down in Osney Mead in Oxford. And we'll hear the Miller's Tale tomorrow. Bye, scholars.